So first, I want to thank everyone for joining Knowledge is Power Foundation for another power session, a much anticipated power session on knowing your legal rights. And today we're pleased to have with us Jillian Pawlow. Welcome, Jillian.
Thank you.
It's great to have you with us. Why don't you give our audience a quick background on you?
Sure. So like Daryl said, my name is Jillian. I have been a lawyer since 2010, graduated law school in 2009. I'm originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I guess in terms of my background with law, when I grew up, my parents were of modest means. My dad grew up extremely poor. My mom was a little step up, like they had enough to eat, unlike my dad. And when I was little, I lived in co-op housing. So it's like a step above public housing, literally and figuratively. We were right next door. And when I got to elementary school, it was very apparent that, even at that time, I loved to read, I loved to argue, I loved to challenge rules, and it was clear that I needed to be challenged in terms of schooling. So my parents opted to stay in co-op housing and send me to private school for elementary. And so in grade 1 was the first time that I heard somebody say, I think you should be a lawyer. It was my teacher. I don't think she meant it in a nice way at that point. I didn't even really know what a lawyer was. Nobody in my family has a professional background. At that point, nobody had even been to university. My dad went when I was 12. He graduated after going part-time for like 6 years. So and this sort of will link into why this type of thing is so important to me. My dad always said, you need to get an education and work your way out of what our background has been. But growing up, I always felt like I kind of didn't really fit anywhere because at home in the co-op, I was, the prissy girl going to private school. And in private school, where everybody had their what I perceived as rich and professional parents, I was like the girl from the hood. So I always have had this inclination to fight for the underdog. And I think that's kind of what led me to a career in law, and then specifically criminal law. I started as a defense counsel and then switched over to become a prosecutor. I can tell you that at the time, based on my background and sort of how they teach you in law school, I had no desire to be a prosecutor. I know maybe this comes as a surprise to you, Daryl, but I just didn't want to work with the police. I, like many people, have seen lots of sort of bad press, and I didn't realize exactly how much defense counsel and Crown work together and how much influence a Crown prosecutor can have on the justice system and being fair and using our discretion to ensure that we are helping people who might be the underdog or connect them with resources and things of that nature. So you said you had asked why sort of this is important. I think it's, I don't know if you've ever seen that speech by Denzel Washington, where he says, once you've sort of made your way out, that it's your responsibility at that point. Each one, teach one. That's how I feel. I feel like everyone should be able to access free information that could potentially help them. And I've realized that I have this privilege and gift of education and knowledge. So I'm here to share.
Awesome. That's an amazing response. And just for some of the viewers who will be watching this, I have worked with Jillian, and let's just say she's very good at what she does, and she's passionate about what she does. And there was no one else I thought of to have on first, especially for this topic. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We don't have a whole lot.
Also, I'll try not to be so long-winded. You know that I like to talk.
No, no comment. No comment. No, answer away, all you please. We will get right into it though, and obviously, Jillian, with what's going on in our world today, and with policing today, and the Black Lives Matter, and all these other movements, I feel there's a huge need for people to know what their rights are, especially when they're dealing with the police. And when KIP Foundation started, it was on this premise. I wanted people to know what their rights were so that they're not being violated. So we talk about the George Floyd video. To be honest, I have a confession to make. I haven't even watched the whole video because I can't. That's how much of an impact it had on me. And so here's an opportunity now for KIP Foundation to give back, maybe help some people know what to do when they're interacting with the police. And the first thing that I can think of is on a traffic stop, for example. And I also find that Canadians watch a lot of American news and American interactions with law enforcement, which is, there's some similarities, but I also think there's huge differences. Can you walk us through maybe a traffic stop to start, and what rights a passenger or the driver of the vehicle may have?
Right. So before I do that, I suppose I should put on my lawyer hat and say that this is not advice. This is for informational purposes only. And it will become very apparent as I answer your question if, when people are listening, that you will likely hear "it depends" from lawyers more often than not. But there are some things that are really important for people to know about in terms of a traffic stop, which is probably where the majority of people will have an interaction with police, I would think. So first, just to get down to the basics, everyone in Canada has rights and freedoms given to them by our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If you have not read it, I suggest Googling, or maybe KIP Foundation can even put on their website just a copy. It's literally like if you were to print it out, a legal size piece of paper that outlines all of the rights that you have in relation to the government, which includes the police. There are all kinds of things in there. I mean, for a one pager, it is pretty heavy. So you've got mobility rights and equality rights and official language rights, minority language education rights, fundamental freedoms, things like freedom of religion, thought, speech, protest. So Black Lives Matter protesters have the right to get together and protest something peacefully. I will say that any right that you are given under the Charter also is subject to the very first clause in that document, which says that every right is subject to reasonable limitations. So no right in Canada is absolute. So I think the problem sometimes is that people will say, I have a right to do this, but they're forgetting that there are limits. So a good example would be freedom of speech, right? Yes, you have a right to say what you would like, but not if it's hate speech. That's a reasonable limitation. And there are lots of limitations when it comes to driving, because driving a vehicle is not a right, it's a privilege. So the police actually have more leeway when it comes to traffic stops than they would in a normal interaction, say if you're walking down the street. So because driving is such a regulated activity, the police do have very wide powers in terms of stopping you. Really, while they should have a reason to stop, they kind of can stop you for any reason, to be honest. Especially now that there's new legislation with respect to impaired driving. So police officers can pull you over and just ask for a sample of your breath at this point, where before they couldn't do that without having reasonable grounds to believe that you had consumed alcohol. Once you're pulled over, they are entitled, under any of the traffic laws in Canada, to ask you for your license, your registration, your insurance. So even though I said I'm not giving advice, but my personal view is that when you get pulled over, know that they're going to ask that. So make your life easier and the life of the officer pulling you over easier, and just have those things ready. If it's not your common practice to keep your registration and insurance like in your glove box or your center console where it's easily accessible, then like start that as a process and make sure you always have your license. I've been pulled over a few times, and every time I make sure that I have all three of those things so that it's a smooth interaction. They ask that for a number of reasons. They can run your name to make sure that you don't have any warrant. Like often they'll go back to their vehicle, right? So they're looking to see if you've have proper registration, insurance, that your license is one, that you have one, that it's up to date, it hasn't expired, and then they're going to run your name and find out if you have any warrants for your arrest, that type of thing. I think everybody needs to remember that a traffic stop at roadside is probably one of the most dangerous positions for an officer to be in. And I know that seems sort of silly because to you, you're just driving around, but you need to put yourself in the position of an officer who doesn't know who they're stopping. And so one, you've got, weather, you've got people who are speeding by, even though we have laws that say you're supposed to slow down. Most people don't slow down or pull over. And then this idea that they're sort of out there alone on the road. Like it's often one officer. They're armed, but they're not pulling up, at least in Canada, often with their guns drawn or even their hand on their gun or anything like that. They're coming to your window and they don't know what they are facing. So I think to be as polite and as calm as possible will just make your interaction that much easier. So they do have a right to ask you for that. If you're a passenger in a vehicle, they may ask your name and for your ID. They're not entitled to that information. So you do not have to give that information to the officer. Again, sometimes, as much as they're not entitled to it, it's kind of a pick your battle type of situation. So you can choose to say, no, I'm not going to give that to you. You also might not be aware exactly why they pulled the vehicle over. So keep that in mind too. So let's say you're driving in a vehicle with your friend. That vehicle is stolen. You don't know it's stolen, but the officer who just ran the plate knows that it is. So now we're not dealing with just a normal traffic stop for speeding. We're dealing with a criminal investigation. And so the powers of the police officer change. So it's very difficult that's why it's so difficult for me to even give a concise answer to say, this is what your rights are when you're stopped by the police, because it depends on the circumstance and what is in the mind of that officer. So if it's just because they're, being nosy and asking you for your ID, no, they're not allowed to do that, but they do sometimes. But it may also be that they are engaged in what we call an investigative detention with respect to the driver. And so they're trying to figure out who they're dealing with altogether. So I think you need to keep that in mind when you are interacting with police. And then there's also a huge difference in terms of if people are watching from the States, for instance, the police there, and I don't practice law in the States, so I won't get into it too much, but they have really broad powers in terms of searching vehicles. They can basically rip your car apart and take the bumpers off, like rip the ceiling out. They can't do that here without any reason in Canada. So if you are asked by an officer, can I search your vehicle? I would be very hesitant to consent to any search without knowing what they're looking for and what my rights are. So before you give your consent to an officer, you do have a right to speak to a lawyer. And so I wouldn't be quick to give my consent when it's not informed. That being said, if you have, for instance, a prohibited weapon just laying out, or open liquor in your vehicle in the center console, and it's easily visible to an officer, well, that's a different story. We have a in plain view doctrine where police officers are allowed to follow up on in searches of things that they can see that are apparent. If they're coming to your window and they see something that you're not supposed to have and you're driving, they're allowed to then proceed with, now they're moving into an investigation with respect to the weapon or respect to open liquor in a vehicle. And they can start to ask you to get out of the vehicle. They can start to go in and search for that. Their search needs to be reasonable. So let's use the weapon, or let's say you have some drugs that are easily very visible. It used to be marijuana, but now that it's legalized, it's a little different now, right? Because most other drugs don't have a scent. So before, it was the officer put their head in the window and they're saying, "Oh, I smell some marijuana. Okay, get on out." Now, okay, you smell marijuana, who cares, unless you're engaging in an impaired investigation. But the one thing that people should know is that officers are limited in their search powers in terms of where they can look in your vehicle. But it's dependent upon what they're looking for. So something that's big, let's say they're looking for weapons, they shouldn't be going into your vehicle, opening the trunk, going into a bag, looking into another tiny bag, and then, they find cocaine or something. That cocaine's likely going to be tossed in a trial because there was it wasn't reasonable for them to look in all those spots. So the smaller the item is, it's kind of a little bit easier for police officers to justify where they're looking. But if it's a big item, they're not going to have that right to do that. So again, it sort of depends on what's happening at the roadside, but you are obligated to give your license, registration, and insurance, answer their questions. I mean, Daryl just shared with me a video of an officer who was pulled over, and the officer who was pulling him over says, "Why did you take this road?" And like he says in the video, he's thinking, "Well, I can go on whatever road I want." And if I was pulled over, that's what I would be thinking too. Why are you asking me this? My husband, well, he was my boyfriend at the time, but my husband and I were pulled over one time and we weren't doing anything. And that initial inclination is to think, like, why are you pulling us over? Like, we were lost, so we took a turn. I guess we took a turn and then another turn. So they wanted to know what we were up to. Yeah. And they were, there were two officers, one on my side, one on his side. And I know my rights, and it was extremely intimidating because you're seated in a vehicle, you're confined, there are people standing at your windows, and you don't know what they want. But I think if you approach any situation like that thinking the best and knowing your rights, but not necessarily having to say them all the time, I think that goes a long way. Mm-hmm. So I think we've seen, both of us, files before where people are quite adamant, like, this is my right, and sometimes they're wrong because they don't understand all the nuances. But having somebody, an officer come up and then the first thing you do is start yelling at them. Imagine if you are at work and somebody comes at you, the reaction that you have versus somebody who just says hello. Right. So I think that it's really important when we're talking about these interactions that everybody be expected to have a modicum of respect and calmness so that no one is agitating the situation. And I agree with you. If you start doing something where the officer feels like you are obstructing them, then we're moving into a different issue altogether, and you may just find yourself getting arrested for obstructing an officer. And when
right.
it could have been a very simple 2-minute interaction and you could have been on your way. So, yeah.
And I believe that what you said is bang on. It's the respect thing, and it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you'll find a smoother interaction, especially roadside like that. However, I know in the States, for example, we see a lot of videos and examples of the driver demanding to see a supervisor or demanding that a supervisor attend. Is something like that similar in Canada? Can they demand a supervisor? I'm just thinking about a rural policing situation where there might not be another member for quite some distance. Can you demand a supervisor attend a traffic stop?
I think you can demand. You do not have a right to have a supervisor attend. You might ask for that person, but again, like you've said, in terms of logistically, where you are being pulled over and how quickly someone else can get there. Part of the reason why we have these so you have a right to not be, it's just sort of live your life, right? You have a right to go and be driving your vehicle and not be interfered with by the police. The point of traffic stops are that they're supposed to be quick. If the officers start keeping you at the roadside for a very, very long time, even if it was your request, we're moving into a really dangerous territory of now, when are you entitled to a right to counsel? When does it become that it's an unreasonable detention? So people need to be aware too that the officers have those things going on in their mind as well. And no, there's no right that you have a supervisor. If something is happening that is, if something's happening that is completely outrageous and you really are concerned for your safety, I suppose you could call 911 and have a recording. There is no law that prevents you from using your phone to record, even though some officers will tell you that there is. So I think it's hard because there are so many interactions that we see right now where people are recording, and it's coming to light that there is some really serious issues with, systemic racism in policing and interactions that really should not have transpired the way that they did. So I don't blame people for feeling uneasy. I think maybe, again, as a standard practice, maybe have your cell phone just accessible and turn it on before the officer gets to the car, because the more times you are reaching for things, again, then we come back to that officer doesn't know who you are. So for you, you're just reaching for your phone. Well, they can't read your mind. So to them, you could be reaching for a gun. So that's where the reaction comes from the police. So everybody's coming at these interactions with a different perspective, right? So if you're hearing a lot of people who come from, racialized minority groups who are saying these are my interactions with police, and this is why I'm reacting the way I am. And then you hear sometimes often more affluent white people who are saying, well, I only look at the police as being there to help me. Well, that's because of the background that you come from. And then you have to also remember the background of the officer that you're dealing with. Everyone's coming in with a different bias. And so I think it's helpful for people in general just to be aware that the police are there to enforce the law, and they're also there, they have to uphold your rights. But there's also a safety component. So the more you can recognize that and sort of not do sudden movements, reaching behind you, reaching at your hip, the more you can be prepared. And that's why I was saying before the officer gets to the window, if you're concerned, tap the record button then. It's going to take them a few minutes to get out of the car anyway. And so have your 3 documents ready and have your cell phone on then. Don't wait until things get agitated and then start saying, I'm going to record, I'm going to, put my phone right in your face. That it's not going to go well, whether you think you have a right to do it or not. So.
Okay. And so if somebody feels like during an interaction with law enforcement that certain rights were violated, or say they receive a traffic violation ticket, but they feel like certain rights were violated, is there a recourse, or what recourse would that individual have? Can they call their Crown prosecutor? Do they have to go through a defense attorney? What recourse would somebody have?
So it sort of depends, but you do have many rights when it comes to the court process. So you have rights if you're being arrested, following arrest. So for instance, I've mentioned a right to counsel. You have a right, just like in the United States, we don't have what's called Miranda rights, but we have a right to remain silent, a right to counsel, a right to be told why you're being detained or arrested. You have all those rights. And then once you have been arrested, there are an additional set of rights. If you're brought back to the detachment by an officer, for instance, you have a right not only for them to say you have a right to counsel, but officers need to facilitate your ability to contact counsel. You might not have a lawyer. And so they need to provide you with a number for legal aid, a phone book, or in this age, that's starting to change because we don't necessarily have phone books anymore, or not all lawyers take out an ad in a phone book. So now it's starting to become, you have to give someone an iPad or a cell phone so that they can Google who they might want to speak to. So we're seeing this, the technology is really changing the way that we proceed. So you have all those rights at the detachment. Then you have a right to reasonable bail if you've been arrested. So you cannot be held, unlike the United States, where there's this presumption that you're held until you pay a bond. That's not how it works here in Canada. The presumption is you will be let go after your arrest. And there's sort of a ladder, that's what we call it, a ladder in the criminal code of things that the Crown can suggest to a judge if there are concerns that you won't show up, or concerns that you've committed too many offenses, those type of things. Then once we go into the actual trial portion, you have a right to what we call disclosure. So when you have an investigation happening from the police, all that information is relayed to the Crown and then given to the accused. So that's the person who is accused of committing a crime, right? Sometimes if it's a traffic ticket or something very minor, it may be something that you can deal with on your own. And you may have a Crown prosecutor who takes a look at the file and really should be using their discretion, whether or not, if you're a self-represented accused, whether you raise the issue or not, as an officer of the court and as a representative of the state, so the country, or I don't like to say government, because prosecutors aren't, they're employed by the government, but their actions are not dictated by the government. It's a lot less political here than in the United States. Again, this is where our neighbors sometimes influence people's perception of what happens in the justice system. So their DAs or district attorneys are elected into their positions, and they're very much caught up on conviction rates and that type of thing, so that they can go to their constituents later and say, listen, I have a 99% conviction rate. Well, there's some dangers to that. And in Canada, we don't do that. The people who are prosecutors are civil servants, and they are hired. And whether, when I have been a Crown, whether I lose all my cases or win all my cases, it doesn't matter. There really is no winning or losing mentality in the Crown prosecutor's office. It is what is fair and what is just. So just in terms of the public at large, but also the accused. So as a prosecutor, they should be using their discretion to look and say, listen, this is a very glaring issue where that person's rights were violated. And so they can just get rid of the charge. So we can withdraw a charge or enter a stay of proceedings is what it's called. as a result of that. There are some other remedies that you can get if you have a violation of your rights when you are interacting with police. So, for instance, you can have evidence that doesn't go before the judge or the jury, depending what it is. So you can have exclusion of evidence. You can have costs, which are very unusual, or you can have a stay of proceedings, so your charges all are dismissed. So it is a very, we call them charter breaches. So charter breaches or charter violations are extremely technical areas of law. So if you do not have a prosecutor who agrees with you in the first instance and says, okay, you're right, I'm going to toss this charge, I would highly recommend seeking out advice from a defense lawyer. If you can't afford a lawyer, then you can go to legal aid and hopefully make an application there and be successful in that application. There are some rules surrounding how much money you make before you qualify for legal aid. But people should also know that most lawyers will give you like 30 minutes of their time for free to sort of assess your case. And so if you go in prepared, you can probably make really great use of their advice during that time period. But yeah, as I've said, a lot of things it depends. And so everything is going to require that defense counsel or the Crown to look at that disclosure. So everything that transpired, and then make a determination whether they believe there's been a violation of your rights, and then what the remedy should be if there is a violation.
Okay. It's such a topic that you cannot squeeze into 20 minutes.
No, I'm sorry.
That's absolutely great.
We take full, criminal procedure, full year courses in law school, which still don't cover everything. I had a whole course on just search and seizure while I was in law school. So that's one right out of the many that are under the charter. So
that's right.
I hope that this assists somebody, but know that we're just scraping the surface.
Yeah, I have no doubt that you've already assisted somebody, one of the KIP followers, but I have also no doubt that you've generated a lot more questions that if you have questions, feel free to send them in to kipfoundation.ca. We'll find a time to end it because, like I said, we'll go on forever. But the thing about KIP Foundation is, and as you know, we're not anti-police, we're not anti-public, we're not. At the end of the day, all KIP Foundation encourages is that the knowledge is available for people out there. And that goes for the public, and that also goes for law enforcement officers, because I have worked with some who are enforcing the law, but maybe don't necessarily know everybody's rights. And it's not a knock on them. You talked about how you went to law school for years. All of this is squeezed into a 5 or 6 month period for a lot of these officers who have a lot of other things to learn at the same time. So there are some people out there who maybe don't know exactly everything they should know. But at the end of the day, when we're dealing with interactions with the police, if respect is going both ways, regardless if you leave that traffic stop feeling that it didn't go the way you think it should have, there are remedies to correct those actions at a later date. And the important thing at that time is that everybody leaves that traffic stop safely. I think I see you nodding your head. I think you agree.
Agreed.
With that. Okay.
Absolutely. I don't think that you will ever win an argument at roadside with respect to a charter violation. So the best thing to do is to, if you feel that there has been a violation, again, if you haven't recorded videotaping it, jot down your thoughts right away so that you can remember exactly what happened, because over time our memories start to shift a little bit and we get influenced by other people and things of that nature. So write down what it is and then go seek out some legal advice from somebody who is educated and trained in the law and can give you an appropriate response. And like you've said, Daryl, I think that's really important. I mean, we expect our officers to know the law, and it's not really an excuse to say we don't know the law. However, there will be some officers who may not have been fully trained in a particular area. And so it might be the case that at the traffic stop, you actually know more than the officer, depending on what you have taken time to learn yourself. But again, I just don't think that you're going to win any any arguments at the roadside. It's not going to end well.
That's right. And so the video that you had referenced earlier, it's a YouTube video. I searched, I think it came up, white cop pulls over black cop, and it's Michael Lawrence, I believe is the name. I encourage all of our viewers to watch it. It just gives a very interesting perspective of how, even though this fellow was law enforcement, how nervous he was at this traffic stop, and how he gained a better appreciation of how people he might stop in the future feel when they're interacting with the police. So I would encourage everyone to watch that if they have an opportunity. I think it's up to about 1.5 million viewers already. So it's working its way around the internet. So
yeah, it's Jillian, a great video. Yeah.
I thank you so much for your time today. I'll let you close us out. Do you have any closing remarks? I know this is, I haven't run this by you yet, but this is part one of, I hope, many part series with Jillian. But I'll let you close us out here today with some remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And like I said, I hope that something that I've said may have inspired somebody to either go seek out some further information or ask a question. I certainly am always, I'm a pretty open book. So if you have questions about anything that I've said, send them into KIP Foundation. I would love to respond to them. I'm about to go on a new move to a different province, so I will have a little bit more time to come back and answer any questions that people have. And thank you, Daryl, for starting something like this. Like you've said, not anti-police, not anti, public. It's just an incredible way to get people to come together and share whatever knowledge that they have. And maybe there might be somebody out there who you don't know personally yet, who is a member of the KIP Foundation family, who has their own expertise that they could potentially lend to the foundation. So I hope that seeing some of us come on and share what we are knowledgeable about might inspire somebody else to share whatever gift that they have as well. So let's keep the ball rolling on free information for everybody.
Well said. Excellent. Thank you again, Jillian, and we'll end this power session at this time. We look forward to receiving your questions for Jillian, and we'll make sure that they get to her and that they're answered in a timely fashion, but she's moving soon, so we'll give you some slack there, Jillian. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
We'll be in touch. Bye.
Bye.